Hello, everyone, and welcome to the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire's third and final Spring Global Tipping Points event. We're so happy you have decided to join us for this program and to learn more about the U.S. and China's strategic economic competition. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to remind everyone that we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and therefore do not take any stances on policy, politics, or issues. We are here as a platform for discussion and hope that you take what you learn here tonight and formulate your own opinions and decisions around this topic. Also, as a membership organization, we rely on the generous support of our members, donors, and sponsors. Thank you all for your help in making this global community possible. A special thank you to Southern New Hampshire University, our mission partner, as well as to Stephen and Karen Barndollar, Helen Taft and Peter Bowman, and Janet Prince and Peter Berg. Your support for this specific event is invaluable, and we cannot thank you enough. Additionally, I'd like to remind everyone that we will be taking your questions throughout the evening tonight, and we hope to get through as many of them as possible. We always get such an amazing number of questions. We can't get to them all, and I'm sure that will be the case here tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your thoughts and questions with us. There are a couple of ways that you can send us your questions: through our social media accounts, through the Messenger app in the bottom right-hand corner of our homepage website, as well as to the council email. We are so looking forward to hearing what your interests in this discussion are. I would now like to bring on Irina Karmenova from the Office of the Public Liaison at the U.S. Department of State to say a few words. Irina?
Thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to the World Affairs Councils of New Hampshire. My name is Irina Karmenova. I work in the Office of Public Liaison, and our mission is to serve as the front door of the State Department to the American public. And we facilitate conversations around diplomacy and our work overseas with American audiences, such as yourselves with the World Affairs Council here in New Hampshire. We also work with universities and high schools around the country, Rotary clubs, Kiwanis clubs, chambers of commerce, and additional World Affairs Councils. So we're really excited to be here today. And I have a short 1 minute long video of introduction to the State Department. And Tim, you can kick that off.
It's a wonderful and complex world out there, filled with challenges and opportunities. That's why America's diplomats with the U.S. Department of State are on the job every day representing you. We are advancing America's foreign policy interests by uniting our allies, confronting our adversaries, and protecting our citizens. We advance democracy, human rights, global health, and more. We grow markets that create American jobs. We are America's first federal agency, and we're in 190 countries at over 270 U.S. embassies and consulates, serving you. We are the United States Department of State.
Thank you so much, Irina. We really appreciate you partnering with us on this program to bring this critical discussion to our state. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Valerie Santos. Valerie is a Foreign Service officer with the Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs in the Department of State's East Asian and Pacific Affairs Bureau. Previous assignments for Valerie include Japan, Tokyo, Japan, and Lima, Peru. And prior to becoming a Foreign Service officer, Ms. Santos worked on trade issues for the Department of State and on environmental and climate management issues with USAID in Asia. She also worked as a private sector communications research consultant and spent time as a Peace Corps volunteer. Ms. Santos has a master's degree in international health from Johns Hopkins University, as well as a bachelor's degree in foreign service from Georgetown University. Thank you so much, Valerie, for joining us tonight, and we look forward to your remarks.
Hi, thank you very much for that introduction and warm welcome. I'm very excited to have the chance to speak with all of you today. Today I'm here to talk about U.S.-China relations, and specifically our U.S.-China strategic economic competition. But before I get started, I just wanted to explain a little bit about what we do on the desk and the issues that I cover. So I am one of about 25 to 30 officers on the China desk, which is divided into several units. We have a bilateral affairs unit, a global unit, a regional unit that looks at China's relationships in the region with Southeast Asia and with Northeast Asia. We have an operations unit that covers a little bit of everything, looking at mostly at the logistics, keeping us all together, the glue that holds us all together. And I work on the economic unit. And within the economic unit, I cover a broad range of issues, mostly related to technology and critical infrastructure. So with that, I want to start with my formal remarks. I'll start by explaining the scope of the China challenge and how this administration views U.S.-China relations through the prism of strategic competition. Next, I will explain how the new administration plans to address the China challenge from a position of strength, particularly by working more closely with our allies and partners. Lastly, I will touch briefly upon some areas of potential cooperation between the United States and China, though I will emphasize this administration is clear-eyed about Beijing's failure to uphold its past international commitments and will keep these shortcomings in mind as we pursue a results-oriented relationship with the People's Republic of China. After my talk, I would be glad to answer any questions that you might have about U.S.-China relations and my work here at the State Department. But before I begin, I really want to emphasize that our concerns with China are about the actions of its government, and certainly not with the Chinese people. With that, I'll start by defining the China challenge. For the State Department, the U.S.-China relationship is arguably one of the most critical bilateral relationships in the world. China is still one of the largest U.S. trading partners, our third largest export market, and a top source of imports. There's no doubt that Beijing poses the most significant challenge of any nation to the United States. The United States is now in serious competition with the PRC, People's Republic of China, for influence around the world. As a result, strategic competition is the framework through which the new administration sees the U.S.-China relationship. The United States needs to adjust to the international strategic environment, which has changed significantly in recent years, as has the PRC itself. There was once a broad consensus that economic liberalization in China would lead to political liberalization, but that has not happened. Instead, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, the PRC has been growing more authoritarian at home and more aggressive abroad. Beijing is now challenging our security, prosperity, and values in significant ways that require the United States to change our policy and posture from what it was before. This administration is committed to meeting this challenge. For example, Beijing is engaged in a range of conduct that hurts American workers, distorts trade, and blocks market opportunities to protect its own domestic industry. It blunts our technological edge and threatens our alliances and influence in international organizations. Inside of China, the PRC authorities are committing gross human rights violations against minority populations in Xinjiang and Tibet that shock the conscience, while undermining freedom and the rule of law in Hong Kong. The PRC is asserting increasing control over its private sector and has enacted laws that require companies to provide access to data, infrastructure, and facilities upon request without any independent judicial checks and balances. Our trust in these companies to manage our data and critical infrastructure cannot exist in such an environment. In tandem with this move towards intrusive, opaque regulatory control is an effort to align China's private sector with the ideological goals and activities of the Chinese Communist Party. Requirements for publicly listed companies to establish CCP, Communist Party committees, enactment of the corporate social credit system, and other such measures illustrate the intent of a CCP Central Committee memo on the topic published last year, which laid out the CCP's plan to strengthen the party's leadership over the private sector and bring the majority of private economy practitioners closer to the party. We've seen a quote from Xi Jinping himself that talks about using the private sector as a backbone and at the ready for any instance where it's needed. Externally, China's military modernization, coupled with its aggressive actions, such as the militarization of the South China Sea, for example, presents an increasingly urgent challenge to our vital interests in the Indo-Pacific region and around the world. The Belt and Road Initiative is Beijing's ambitious program for linking markets across Eurasia, Africa, and beyond. Launched in 2013, BRI is a broad assortment of infrastructure and development projects that the PRC uses to create new markets for Chinese exports, new sources of energy and other raw materials for China's factories and power plants, and new avenues for rewriting international rules and standards to serve Beijing's political and economic interests. The Belt and Road Initiative has been central to the PRC's global economic statecraft, with projects in 130 countries all over the world. These projects can offer few benefits to the host economy, using Chinese capital to pay Chinese companies to build projects with Chinese labor, with limited spillover benefits to the economy while introducing predatory lending practices with opaque terms and significant claims of corruption. There are also significant claims of negative environmental impact and poor labor practices. As you know, our relationship with China is not only competitive, but also very complicated. There are adversarial aspects to the relationship. There are certainly competitive ones, and there are some cooperative ones too. This is especially true in our economic relationship. For example, technology is at the center of our U.S.-China competition. Yet, we have also identified areas of engagement and potential cooperation, such as addressing the climate crisis. But regardless which aspect we're dealing with, we have to approach China from a position of strength. The United States represents about a quarter of the world's economy, but with our allies and partners in Europe and Asia, we together represent well over half the world's economy. And that provides us not just the kind of leverage we need to be able to produce outcomes, but it also forms a chorus of voices that say we are going to stand up together for a certain set of principles in the face of aggression and the kind of actions Beijing is taking. Strength also comes from engaging in the world and fully participating in international institutions, such as the United Nations or the World Health Organization. Because when we pull back, China fills the void. And then they're the ones who are writing the rules, filling the leadership positions, and setting the norms of these institutions. We will speak with clarity and consistency on these issues, and we will be prepared to act in concert with our allies to impose costs on China for widespread human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Tibet, for trampling democracy in Hong Kong, and for the aggressive threats that is projecting toward Taiwan. We strengthen our competitive edge when we take steps to protect our most sensitive technologies and critical infrastructure, including through export restrictions, investment screening, and visa screening, and by raising awareness of the risks with our allies and partners and asking them to take similar actions. Strength naturally comes from making sure that our military is well equipped and postured so that it can deter China aggression. But it also comes from investing in our own people and domestic sources of strength, including our workforce, technology, and supply chain security. We need to be leading the world in developing the key emerging technologies for the future: semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, clean energy, and so much else. And that requires a combination of working closely with allies and partners and making aggressive, ambitious investment here in the United States so that we can stay on the cutting edge. We also need to remain a country open to attracting and retaining foreign talent. This is no longer a partisan issue. Leading Democrats and Republicans are now in agreement on the need to spend more in these areas to outcompete Beijing. We're also working with our allies and partners to build capacity and offer funding options for infrastructure through initiatives such as the Development Finance Corporation, the Blue Dot Network, and Infrastructure Transaction and Assistance Network, known as ITAN, while promoting vendor diversity in critical 5G infrastructure and advocating for a vibrant digital economy worldwide. The Biden administration understands that there are going to be some issues where we might be able to cooperate on a limited basis with Beijing. For example, we will conduct results-oriented diplomacy with China on shared challenges such as climate change, as I mentioned, and public health. But Beijing's failure to uphold its past international commitments is a significant factor in how we will develop our approach to China. We are clear-eyed, and we will keep those past shortcomings in mind as we deal with the PRC. This administration will not pursue cooperation for cooperation's sake. Instead, we will work together with our allies and partners to hold Beijing accountable when it fails to live up to its international commitments. I will stop there and will be happy to respond to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. We really appreciate you providing us with your insights. I would love to remind people that we are open to take your questions. We have a couple coming in already, but as moderator, I will take the opportunity to ask a few of my own questions before we get into the audience questions here. So the thing that I have not heard a lot about recently, that we had heard quite a bit about in the during the Trump administration, was this trade war between the U.S. and China. There was a phase 1 trade agreement, and there were supposed to be continued discussions about that. Can you give us a little bit of insight as to where those discussions currently stand? Does the Biden administration plan on continuing those discussions, or is it something that we've moved on from?
Sure, thank you. I cannot say a lot about that, but I can give you a little bit of information. So our U.S. trade policy is led by USTR. And so thinking about that, the U.S. Trade Representative was only confirmed somewhat recently and has only been in the job now for, several weeks, but still new on the job. And she is responsible for the entire world and our trade policy with the entire world. So I know that our U.S. trade with China is very important, and USTR is taking a comprehensive look at our policy, at the strengths of our current policies, and considering what our future actions should be.
Sure. So you also mentioned the Belt and Road already, but one question that I do have is, there are all these issues around Belt and Road for the countries that get involved with it, as you pointed out. But how can the U.S. provide an alternative? What are we currently doing? What possibly could we be doing more to combat the power of the Belt and Road Initiative?
Sure, thank you for that question. So we are looking at developing more alternatives, and trying to work with countries to develop project financing options. So far under the previous administration, we We do have the Development Finance Corporation, as I said, the Blue Dot Network, and the Infrastructure Transaction and Assistance Network that are all aimed at providing infrastructure and assistance, capital, as well as technical assistance to foreign governments. And then the current administration is looking at what else they can do to really develop a robust options to help our allies and partners.
And can you elaborate a little bit on any specific allies or partners that the Biden administration, I don't want to say is going to prioritize, but feels needs a lot of assistance and something that we're going to really focus in on?
Thank you for that question. We have relations all over the world, and so it's a matter of looking at which countries have the greatest need and where the United States priorities are. As you can imagine, we help where we can when the governments are willing to partner with us.
Yeah. The next area I wanted to chat about today, we saw the U.S. government formalizing sanctions against 59 firms in China, mostly tied to defense and CCP people. Can you talk a little bit about, I know it's early stages and there's probably not too much to unpack just at this moment, but just a little bit about the reasoning behind that, what the concerns are, and why the Biden administration took this out of the Department of Defense and made it more of an official stance.
Sure. Thank you very much for that question. Right. So this announcement was just made earlier today, and the administration is looking at, they agree with the underlying foundations of the previous executive order, which was trying to prevent U.S. investments that would enable, the PRC's military modernization efforts. We see a lot of problems with, or concerns with the military civil fusion strategy and how the PRC is co-opting its private sector to develop its the advancement of its military. However, there were legal flaws with the previous executive order, and it was challenged in courts. And so with that, the administration wanted to establish a better foundation, a legally defensible, more flexible authority, so that we can focus on the companies that are operating within the defense industrial complex. The administration has also added the additional focus on surveillance technologies. We're very concerned with the PRC's use of surveillance technology to enable serious human rights abuses, to enable repression both within its borders, as well as export this model of techno-authoritarianism to other countries. I'm going to say thank you.
Okay. So that leads us into a question we have from one of our audience members, Maury. He'd like to know if we have any examples of the costs that the U.S. has imposed on China and how we're holding them accountable given its behavior in Hong Kong, South China Sea, etc. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. You can look at not in my wheelhouse. My bilateral unit colleagues focus more on the sanctions in regards to Hong Kong and Xinjiang, but we have taken a stance and imposed sanctions on PRC officials for their role in eroding the autonomy of Hong Kong, committing serious human rights abuses in Xinjiang as well. We are also restricting U.S. capital in terms of securities, transactions, and investments, as well as U.S. technologies from being exported to China so that it can be used for the PRC's advantage to develop their military capabilities.
So that then leads me into Taiwan. They, from what I've been reading, feel that they're next after Hong Kong, what they've seen happen there. And one of the more interesting things that I see in China's economic statecraft is tying aid to countries that then surprisingly a few days later pull their support from Taiwan. Is this a concern for the U.S. government? I know we have a very delicate relationship between Taiwan and China and the U.S., but what can we do within our current relationship status, as we'll say, to combat some of these issues that are going on around pulling support for Taiwan?
Thank you. We are very concerned about the PRC's use of coercive practices to manipulate some of our closest partners and allies, particularly in terms of bilateral relationships, but also in international forum. And so we are looking to become more actively engaged in international standards bodies and international multilateral forums, such as the UN system, to gather the collective values of our partners and allies and really raise our voices together stand up against the PRC and their authoritarian regime and values.
Yeah. So we got another question here that I think is very interesting from Denise, and she's wondering what the long-term goal / relationship that the U.S. government is hoping to have in regards to China.
Thank you for that question. It's as I said, it's a very complicated relationship. We approach the relationship from a position of strength, but there are definitely, adversarial, competitive, and cooperative aspects of this relationship. At this point, we are just clear-eyed. We have seen, a history of China just not fulfilling its international commitments, whether it's in trade or other areas. And although we have tried to encourage the PRC to fulfill its commitments, they have consistently fallen short of that. And so we are no longer approaching this relationship from one where we will just talk for talk's sake, but we really, when we do approach our relationship with China, we want to set goals and clear commitments that they will have to meet, or before we will entertain any future dialogues with China.
So this may not fall under your purview per se, but one thing that I have been thinking about, and it goes beyond China really, but the use of sanctions by the U.S. We have the currency franca, if you will, and that gives us a lot of power to use our sanctions. Obviously, China sanctions us, but what I've been reading is that I found interesting and unsurprising, I guess, is that China is, of course, trying to get adoption of the yuan as the global currency. So what can we do? Is this something that we need to be concerned about and work to ensure that the supremacy of the U.S. dollar continues? And what sort of steps can we take to ensure that happens?
Thank you for that question. This is really more in Treasury's wheelhouse to answer this question, and I'm sure that they are looking at options right now. However, with the development of the current digital currency that the PRC is working on, we don't see that this will in any way challenge the supremacy of the dollar. We do have concerns about how it will be used, along with its social credit system, as a form, another form of surveillance and repression within the country.
Sure. And speaking of surveillance and suppression, of course, we have the case of Huawei and their interest in getting involved with 5G networks around the world. Can you talk a little bit about what the stance of the Biden administration is on their inclusion in 5G networks and why there are or are not concerns?
Sure, there are definitely concerns, and the Biden administration continues to raise 5G as a priority. We are looking at the security of critical information communications technology and infrastructure. One of the largest risks is that the PRC has laws that compel companies to provide access to data and equipment and infrastructure upon request. And the PRC does not have an independent judiciary, no checks and balances, disregard for rule of law, for human rights and privacy. With all of this in mind, it's very difficult or nearly impossible to trust companies that fall under the jurisdiction of such an authoritarian regime. In addition, Huawei has a track record of corruption and intellectual property theft, and it's just not a company that we can trust. So the administration is looking to continue its diplomatic engagement with foreign allies and partners to encourage similar actions to exclude Huawei from critical infrastructure. We're also looking at other aspects of critical infrastructure as well, and promoting vendor diversity.
Sure. So I guess following on to that question, you've mentioned a couple of times the integration between private sector and public sector in China. Public sector is probably not the right term, but we hear a lot about intellectual property theft. We hear a lot about transfer of information from U.S. firms to the CCP. What steps can we be taking to ensure the protection of intellectual property, that we are working with companies in China in a fair and appropriate manner?
Thank you. Let me try to unpack this question. Of course, we're taking a whole of government approach to protecting intellectual property. So, you can look at the law enforcement standpoint, FBI, and what it's doing to prevent the loss of intellectual property data. We also have a process, an investment screening process in place that reviews investments in the United States to prevent China or the PRC's, tech acquisition through legal means that they then can use against the United States and harm U.S. interests. So it's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and it looks at the national security threats to our most sensitive technologies. So we are not trying to keep out all investment or all foreign investment that comes from the PRC, but we are looking strategically at our most sensitive areas and national security interests.
So we've had a couple of questions come in regarding TPP. Can you give some insight into the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the U.S. backed away from, and a potential return of the U.S. to an agreement like that?
That's one area that I would really defer to USTR to make any statements on TPP at this point.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Thank you, though.
course. So Ramesh would like to know, should we be worried about China expanding their military, particularly their naval capabilities? Is it a prelude to future conflict, maybe not with the U.S., but perhaps with other nations in Asia?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Yes, what we are looking at, no doubt, is that China is a major threat, and not only to U.S. interests, but also to our closest allies and partners. Looking at the South China Sea and the militarization of the South China Sea as an example. There are also border disputes with some of its neighbors. So yes, what we can do about it from an economic competition standpoint is looking at restricting their access to technologies that may be critical to advancing their military modernization. So through export controls, through looking at their means of tech acquisition, including investments screenings, we're encouraging our allies and partners to really consider similar measures in terms of export controls and investment screening regimes as well. And we're also looking at research integrity and what that means, and trying to raise awareness of the need to protect sensitive data, basic research, as well as trade secrets for our companies.
Sure. So I'd like to talk a little bit about U.S. allies and their ability to help us in our efforts to manage China and our relationship with that country. The Biden administration, of course, is out there saying that we're back. We're back with our allies. We want to support them. What are some of the ways in which partnering with allies can help the U.S. and our allies to manage this sort of conflictual relationship that we have with China?
Sure. Yes, the Biden administration, in every engagement, we underline the importance of working with partners and allies bilaterally, plurilaterally, and multilaterally. So that can involve, bilateral engagements. It can involve working through international organizations, everything from the UN to OECD, APEC, other a multilateral forum, because we are stronger when we work together and our policies are more effective. If we are going to restrict our exports, for example, we want to be sure that they're not just being replaced by foreign technologies from other competitors. I think the example of Xinjiang is a good example of how we can come together and through collective voice and action send a strong message to the PRC that we are not going to stand for its bullying behaviors, on human rights abuses or any other issue for that matter. So recently, not only did the United States take a stand and impose sanctions for human rights abuses in Xinjiang, but some of our closest allies as well have stood up and have enacted similar policies as well.
So continuing that thread of allies, we have a question from the audience here. Does the administration have plans to expand our economic competition with China and Africa, or try and reduce Chinese trade influence for NATO allies like Italy?
Okay, can you show that question one more time?
Sure.
There's a lot in that question.
Yeah. Here we go. So maybe we'll first focus on Africa and then move into the opportunities to work with our NATO allies.
Okay, right. So we have a whole team that is a global unit that is looking at China's strategic relationships in other geographic locations. So I know that the administration is taking a comprehensive approach at this point. We are looking, from top to bottom at our relationships with the various regions, as well as the tools that we are using, and we'll be developing at some point a U.S.-China strategy that will encompass all of this. There's just a lot that's being discussed at this point, so there's not much I can say about whether we will expand or what we will do in these areas.
Sure. So of course we can't get through a program these days, particularly on China, without talking about COVID. So one of our audience members is asking, is the U.S. now at a disadvantage economically due to COVID compared to China, given their swift reopening? What will it take to catch back up if we are at that disadvantage?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. And, I think we were all just taken by surprise. I mean, this past year was unprecedented, and we've all learned to adapt. Whether it's through working at home, or that we've seen a lot of unemployment in the United States. Our strength will be in building back and building back better. So focusing on America and what we can do to regain that strength and get back to work. So that's the first step. But also we do see this as just a highly unusual year, and we know that we will come back stronger. At the same time, we don't anticipate that China's advantage will continue over the long run based on figures from last year.
And then both countries seem to be undergoing their own form of vaccine diplomacy. The Biden administration just announced 25 million or billion, I can't remember which, vaccines that they'll be dedicating to donating around the world. China is doing similar things, sending PPP, sending back their own vaccines around the world. What does that relationship look like? Is that a competitive thing? Is that a cooperative thing? How can the two countries maybe work together in a way to make the pandemic go away as fast as possible, which is something in all of our interests?
Thank you. One of the areas that I don't want to get too far into, but since you've brought it up, I will mention one area where we can cooperate is kind of getting to the bottom of the COVID origins. We are just looking for straight answers and transparent information in terms of the COVID origins, as well as vaccine developments, so that we are better protected and can better address any emerging infectious diseases that may come in the future.
Yeah, so we still have a bit of time, and we're getting great questions. We really appreciate all of the questions coming in from our audience. The next one we have is, can we better leverage international organizations to hold China to account for their actions rather than just doing it bilaterally through our allies?
Absolutely, there is strength in numbers, and when we act together, and raise our voices, we are stronger for it. One example that I can give you is the UN. What is it? It's the ITU, the International Telecommunications Unit, where the PRC had raised a proposal that pretty much reflected their idea of the cyber sovereignty, this great firewall, the authoritarian control over the internet. And working with our allies and partners, we were able to collectively together to stand up and put a stop to that and say, no, we are here to advocate for an open, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet that's developed through a multi-stakeholder bottom-up approach. And we are not going to accept this authoritarian control over the internet.
So another good question here that I really am interested in. Is there any issue in the U.S.-China relationship that currently is flying under the radar and under talked about? I know there's a lot of focus on China and a lot of things that are going on. So there may be a few of these, but maybe your favorite thing that's flying under the radar.
I'm talking about my issues now. That is an interesting question. There is a lot of talk, a lot of focus on China right now. What I can say is that there is a lot of emphasis on China and our relationship, and there is really what I see as bipartisan support for addressing the China challenge. The administration has really stepped up, and we've seen this recently in some bills that they're really just trying to devote more resources and attention to addressing this China challenge. What we're really excited about, are some of the developments and the investments that will be made in terms of, developing strong and resilient and secure supply chains. I'm looking at, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, advanced batteries. And really investing in those sectors, also in developing, investing more in science and technology, because that will sustain us into the future, right? Technology is really going to be a driver of our economy going into the future.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to make. We've talked a lot about China, but of course, there's a lot that the U.S. can do to counteract what has been going on. And that leads into this next question. China has been very aggressive in the past few years on getting more countries to rescind recognition of Taiwan's sovereignty. We talked a little bit about that earlier, but this person would specifically like to know, is the U.S. in a position to slow this, and is that even in our interests?
Thank you. Can't say much about our relationship with Taiwan. There's really, other experts here at the department that follow those issues a lot more closely than me. But I can say that we expect, our policy towards China has not changed. We still have a one China policy. We uphold our international commitments, and we expect that China will uphold its commitments that it has made as well. In terms of Taiwan's involvement, they are part of international organizations, and we think that that's an important, that they play a role in international organizations and have a voice. They have a lot to offer, and we want them to be there.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. So I think this question that just came in is really a good one here. Is there a sense that China has been more hostile to bilateral relations since the Biden administration came into office, or maybe even more friendly? What does the relationship really look like these days between the two countries?
Complex. I think in some regards you can say that they have been increasingly aggressive. If you had seen their press engagement during the meetings in Alaska, you will see that they were quite aggressive with their approach to the administration. But you will also see that there are some areas where we are increasing our cooperation. I think Special Envoy for Climate Kerry's inroads on climate cooperation is an excellent example. And so we do really have right now in our relationship, various aspects: adversarial, cooperative, and competitive.
Well, it certainly is a complex issue and something that we're appreciative of you taking the time to chat with us about. So the next question kind of follows on to that. What's upcoming in the U.S.-China relationship? Are there more summits or meetings on the way between the two countries? What areas are we focusing in?
I don't know how much I can say about what's coming up. I know that there was a climate summit recently. I know that there are opportunities for engagements. There are also maybe more opportunities to impose costs. be on the lookout
Yeah.
for any actions that we may be taking. I think underpinning all of this, though, is the administration is still undergoing its review of our U.S. China policy, and we will be taking a closer look at that policy and how to define the U.S. China strategy. Of course, it will follow very closely with our interim national security strategy, and we'll also consider our national security as well as our economic interests. But I believe that before we see any additional dialogues, for example, that we would want to have a very strong strategy laid out, and as well as commitments from the PRC that they will take concrete actions to become a more participatory, constructive member of the international community, upholding international norms and standards.
Great. So our next question is on climate and technology. So is the U.S. in a position to become an international leader in renewable energy and tech that China also seems to be investing heavily in?
Sure. I can't say much about that. That's not my area of expertise. I hate to say that over and over again, but I can say a little bit about that. And I would point to the Biden administration's commitment to both climate and meeting our climate engagements. We just joined or rejoined I believe it's the Paris Accords. So putting a lot of interest and emphasis on climate and increasing our strength in that area. He's also looking at the supply chains, America's supply chains, and looking at really putting money into developing our resilient and secure supply chains. So there has been an emphasis within the administration to invest in America. And I anticipate that energy is one of those areas.
Yeah, and a question just came in from Cal about rare earth minerals and in electronics. What sort of role does that play in? I know there's the semiconductor shortage and a push by the Biden administration to ramp up production here in the U.S. What are your thoughts around rare earth minerals and China's seeming efforts to get into a lot of these countries and create partnerships or partnerships is the wrong word, but for lack of a better word, partnerships with these countries to extract those necessary minerals?
Sure, and that's one area too that the executive order on America's supply chains is focusing on, and we'll be studying that. I believe that the executive order requires a look at the supply chain and the vulnerabilities and what we can do about that. So be on the lookout as those reports roll out for additional discussions and actions on those areas.
So one of the things that the Biden administration, and including our national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, who is from New Hampshire, has talked about is this idea of a foreign policy for the middle class. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and how we can get people who may not be interested right now in foreign policy, particularly around China, to better understand what's going on and why it's important to them?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, and really ties into what we were just talking about with supply chains. And we have been asked here at the department to really consider, as we are framing our policy, to consider, America and, America's middle class, and what does this mean, and how will this affect them? And so we're really taking this to heart, and we need to do a good job or better job of explaining that to the American people as well. And so I think the semiconductors field is an excellent example where while we are restricting our exports to China in this area, it really is looking at kind of the most advanced technologies that could be used to develop their military modernization efforts. We're allowing some other trade to occur. At the same time, we are seeking foreign investment, from places like Taiwan, economies like Taiwan and Korea, to attract, investments into the United States, factories, research and development centers, which will lead to good-paying jobs for the American people.
Yeah. So I think we've hit you with some pretty hard, tough questions here tonight. So we'll end with a little bit of an easier one for you from Abby. She'd like to know. Actually, sorry, that popped in at the last second. A little off China. What does your day-to-day as a Foreign Service officer look like at the State Department? And then actually the follow-on question there that I accidentally clicked is, any advice for people looking into a future in Foreign Service?
I love that question. What a great way to end. Thank you. Yes, I would encourage anyone who is interested in joining the Foreign Service to really consider it, to take the test. It's a long process to get in, but it's worth it. It's a great career. It's a great opportunity to serve our country and to really advocate for U.S. interests in the U.S. and the American people. We are here to serve you, so thank you for everything that you do as well. If anyone is interested, please feel free to give them my contact information. I'd be happy to talk further with anyone who's interested in pursuing a career in the Foreign Service. So my job on a day-to-day basis here in Washington is really to help inform and shape foreign policy as it relates to China, and particularly on our economic interests. So I'm always looking at what is being said in the news, what is China doing, what are they saying, what policies are they developing, how might those policies how might those affect U.S. interests in terms of business interests, in terms of operational interests, in terms of overall economic interests, and really advocating, for pointing out when we have issues with some of those policies that they're creating. Also looking at how might the policies that they're creating in Beijing then potentially be used in other organizations. How might they be used in international standards bodies, or in UN or other international organizations? And I work with my colleagues in other bureaus around the department to really think through some of these issues and look at what are the roadblocks for our national security and economic interests, and how can we work to stand up and to take a stand against them, whether it's through quiet diplomatic engagements with our foreign counterparts, or if it's more publicly within the press.
Great. So I know I said that was the last question, but that led me into one final one before we let you go. Don't worry, it's an easy one as well. What is the most rewarding part of your job that you find?
The most rewarding part of my job, it's knowing that what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis really makes a difference. We have a very tough relationship here, but, at the center of our foreign policy right now is our U.S.-China relationship. And within the U.S.-China relationship, it's the tech competition policy. And so it's really thinking through how what I do, the papers I produce, the points that I create, how that might impact not only that relationship, but also what does that mean for the American people? And so any way that I can help to advance U.S. interests, even in the very small way that I do here as a desk officer, that is very rewarding. So thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Valerie, for joining us tonight. As we've seen, there's a lot of interest in this topic. This is our third event on China this spring, and we're still getting a wonderful set of great questions. So we really appreciate you giving your time, your insights, and continue the great work that you're doing over at the Department of State.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and talk to you today.
Of course. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us here tonight. We really appreciate all of the wonderful support that you provide to the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire in helping us to build our global community. This is important information. This is important, critical discussions to be had. As the Biden administration continues to talk about the foreign policy for the middle class, this does affect you on a day-to-day basis, whether you feel it or not. We are an interconnected global community, and we really appreciate your help in getting these programs out to the wider world. I will make mention, this is our last official program of the season. We will be hosting our annual meeting on June 17th at 6 p.m. You will need to register for that one. We're holding it on Zoom in order to be a bit more collaborative and bring our community together. So check it out at our website, wacnh.org. And we look forward to seeing you at the annual meeting, as well as hopefully back in person and hybrid online in the fall if we can. So have a wonderful summer, and we look forward to seeing you at our next events. Thanks so much.